It was just one kiss. One forbidden kiss with Marcus, my wife's father, and it's unraveled everything. I didn't mean for it to happen. But in the quiet of his study, with his hand on my shoulder and his eyes holding mine, the unspoken tension between us finally broke. The kiss was soft at first, then intense, pulling me into a feeling I hadn't known in years. Now, I can't stop thinking about him, about the way he made me feel seen, wanted, alive. But what do you do when the man you want is the one you're never supposed to have? This is my confession. Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from. And if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. The smell of roasted chicken hung in the air, mingling with the buttery aroma of garlic bread and the faint, sweet trace of an apple pie cooling on the counter. The house felt warm and alive, though it had been a long time since I could call it cozy. I was leaning against the counter in our small kitchen, sipping a glass of wine and watching Lillian move with meticulous efficiency, wiping the edge of a plate she'd already cleaned 3 times. She always did this, her nervous energy spilling out in little tasks she didn't need to do. Tonight was no exception. Dinner was already set, the table perfectly arranged with the floral centerpiece she'd ordered 2 days ago. But she couldn't stop fussing. This dinner was her idea, a family gathering she insisted was important. "It'll help Dad and me reconnect," she'd said, her voice bright with forced optimism. Lillian was nothing if not persistent when it came to fixing things that couldn't be fixed. "Ethan, can you take this out to the table?" she asked, handing me the breadbasket without waiting for a reply. Her tone was clipped, and her smile felt thin, more an apology than anything genuine. "Sure," I said, trying not to sound like I cared too much one way or the other. I took the basket and headed to the dining room, setting it next to the wine glasses she'd polished to perfection. The doorbell rang just as I stepped back to admire her work. "That'll be him," Lillian said from the kitchen. Her voice was tighter now, tinged with something that sounded like dread. I watched her as she dried her hands, smoothed her dress, and forced another smile. I stayed where I was. If Lillian was nervous, I wasn't sure what I was supposed to feel. I'd met Marcus before briefly at our wedding, and maybe once more at a strained brunch years ago. He was polite, charming even, but distant. I always got the sense that he showed up out of obligation more than anything else. When Lillian opened the door, Marcus strode in like someone who owned the room before even stepping into it. He was taller than I remembered, or maybe it was the way he carried himself. His silver hair caught the light, and his sharp blue eyes scanned the room quickly, assessing everything in a glance before settling on me. "Lillian," he said, pulling her into a brief but firm hug. His voice was rich and calm, the kind of voice you'd trust instantly, even if you knew better. "It's been too long." "It has," she said, her voice almost cracking. She gestured toward me. "You remember Ethan?" "Of course." He smiled, turning to me and extending his hand. His grip was strong but not overpowering, and the warmth in his smile felt almost practiced, like he knew exactly how to make someone feel at ease. "Good to see you again, Ethan." "You too, Marcus," I replied, my voice steady, though something about his presence made me feel off balance. We moved to the table and soon the small talk began. Marcus was good at it, filling the gaps in conversation with well-timed anecdotes and questions that felt more personal than polite. He asked about my work, my hobbies, even a trip Lillian and I had taken last year that I barely remembered mentioning. He had this way of looking directly at you when you spoke, nodding at the right moments, his attention so focused it was almost unnerving. But it wasn't just his attention that unsettled me, it was how I noticed him. The way his voice seemed to resonate in a way I couldn't ignore. The way he leaned back in his chair, completely at ease, commanding the room without trying. By the time the plates were cleared, and the apple pie had been served, I realized I was paying more attention to Marcus than I should have been. "This pie is incredible," Marcus said, his voice breaking into my thoughts. He turned to Lillian with a smile. "You've outdone yourself." "Oh, Ethan made it actually," Lillian said, her voice carrying a note of pride. "He's the baker in the family." Marcus's eyes shifted back to me, his gaze lingering just a moment too long. "Is that so? You'll have to teach me your secret, Ethan. I've never been much of a cook myself." "It's not much of a secret," I replied, trying to sound casual, but my voice felt heavier than I wanted it to. "Just follow the recipe." "Ah, but following instructions has never been my strong suit." His smile widened slightly, almost teasing, before he took another bite of pie. I looked down at my plate, suddenly unsure of what to say. After dinner, as Lillian gathered the dishes, Marcus offered to help, but she waved him off. "No, no. You're a guest. Sit and relax." She shot me a look that said, "Do the same." But I ignored it, following her to the kitchen with an armful of plates. It wasn't until I was rinsing a dish that I realized Marcus had followed me instead. "Let me dry," he said, grabbing a towel from the counter. Oh, you don't have to. I insist, he interrupted, his tone polite but firm. He moved closer, his shoulder brushing against mine briefly as he picked up a plate. We worked in silence for a moment, the only sound the running water and the clink of dishes. You've made quite a life here, Marcus said eventually, his voice low and thoughtful. Yeah, I said, unsure of what he meant. He set a plate down and turned to me, leaning slightly against the counter. His gaze was steady, the corners of his mouth pulling into the faintest smile. Marriage isn't easy, is it? The question caught me off guard, and I hesitated before answering. No, it's not. He nodded, his expression unreadable. But it's worth it, most of the time. There was something in the way he said it, an undercurrent I couldn't place. Before I could respond, Lillian's voice called from the dining room, and Marcus straightened, the moment passing as quickly as it had come. The rest of the evening blurred together. By the time Marcus said his goodbyes and the door closed behind him, I realized I couldn't stop replaying the way he'd looked at me, the way his presence filled the room. That night, as I lay in bed beside Lillian, listening to her soft breathing, I found myself thinking about Marcus again. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something I didn't entirely understand, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the clock on the nightstand. Its numbers flickered, cruelly marking each passing minute that sleep refused to claim me. Beside me, Lillian stirred faintly in her sleep, a soft murmur escaping her lips as she turned over, her back to me. I stared at the ceiling, every nerve in my body buzzing with a strange, electric restlessness. It was Marcus. No matter how much I tried to push the thought away, his face kept forcing itself into my mind. The way his smile crinkled the corners of his eyes, the deliberate cadence of his voice, the way he carried himself like he belonged anywhere he chose to be. And then there was that moment in the kitchen. I replayed it over and over, dissecting it, searching for meaning in the pause before he'd spoken. His words lingered, heavy and layered, echoing in a loop. Marriage isn't easy, is it? It hadn't been a casual remark. I felt that. It was the kind of comment that left something unsaid, a door left ajar. And when he'd looked at me, steady, unflinching, I could feel myself falter, drawn to the space between his words. I sighed, turning onto my side and closing my eyes, willing sleep to come. But it didn't. All I could see was Marcus's gaze fixed on mine, warm and unreadable, like he knew more than I did. Lillian and I had been married for almost 6 years. 6 years of shared milestones, shared routines, and lately shared silences. It wasn't as if we were unhappy. Not exactly. But things felt worn, faded around the edges like an old photograph left too long in the sun. She was still Lillian, my wife, my partner, but there was a distance between us now, one we both noticed but never spoke about. She'd buried herself in her career, and I had let her. I didn't resent her for it. Not entirely, but I couldn't ignore how lonely our home had started to feel. Sometimes I wondered if she noticed, if she even realized how far apart we drifted. But Marcus had noticed. In that brief conversation in the kitchen, he had seen through me in a way that Lillian hadn't in years. He'd asked the kind of question that wasn't meant to be answered, the kind that lingered and forced you to confront things you'd been avoiding. I sat up in bed, the sheets pooling around my waist. The room felt too small, suffocating, and I couldn't shake the tension humming beneath my skin. Marcus had barely been in our home for 2 hours, yet here I was, wide awake in the middle of the night, unable to stop thinking about him. It wasn't just his confidence or the way he seemed to fill every corner of a room. It was how he'd made me feel. Seen, noticed, like I was someone worth listening to, someone worth looking at. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt that way. I ran a hand through my hair, exhaling sharply. This was ridiculous. He was Lillian's father, for God's sake. A fleeting connection. A stray thought, it didn't mean anything. Couldn't mean anything. But the more I told myself that, the less I believed it. The house was eerily quiet as I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Lillian. I padded down the hallway to the kitchen, the cold tile floor grounding me, if only slightly. The remnants of dinner still lingered, the faint smell of garlic bread and chicken, the floral centerpiece now slightly wilted under the dim light of the moon streaming through the window. I poured myself a glass of water, gripping the counter with my free hand as I stared out into the dark backyard. My reflection hovered faintly in the glass, fractured and ghostly, and I barely recognized the man staring back at me. What was wrong with me? This wasn't me. I wasn't impulsive. I wasn't reckless. I loved Lillian, didn't I? I wanted to believe I did, but even now, in the stillness of the night, I couldn't deny that something vital was missing. I thought about the way Marcus had filled the space at the dinner table, how his humor had lit up the room, how he had looked at me, not in the casual way most people do, but deeply, as though I wasn't just there as Lillian's husband. I set the glass down with a hollow clink, the weight of my thoughts pressing against my chest. By the time I returned to bed, the first light of dawn was beginning to creep through the curtains. Lillian was still asleep, her body curled in on itself, her breathing soft and even. I slid under the covers, careful not to disturb her. But as I lay there, staring at the faint outline of her back, I realized something I didn't want to admit. I wasn't just drawn to Marcus because he had noticed me. It wasn't just the way he spoke or the way he carried himself. It was the fact that he made me feel something I hadn't felt in years. Alive. The next morning, the world felt muted, as though the air itself was heavier. Lillian sat across from me at the breakfast table, scrolling through her phone, her coffee untouched. She was quiet, even for her, and I wondered if she had noticed anything off about me last night. She hadn't said much after Marcus left, just a tired, "I think it went well," before disappearing into the bedroom. I hadn't known how to respond then, and I didn't know what to say now. "You okay?" I asked, finally breaking the silence. She glanced up, startled, like she hadn't expected me to speak. "Yeah," she said quickly, offering me a faint smile. "Just thinking about work." Her eyes drifted back to her phone, and I took a sip of my coffee, the bitter taste doing nothing to ground me. As soon as she left for work, the silence of the house pressed in around me. I tried to distract myself, folding laundry, straightening up the living room, even attempting to read a book, but my thoughts refused to settle. Eventually, I grabbed my phone, my thumb hesitating over the screen. I didn't even realize what I was doing until I opened my messages and scrolled down to Marcus's number. The last time I texted him was years ago. A quick thanks for coming after our wedding. The empty thread stared back at me now, daring me to fill it. I told myself it was just polite, just a thank you. I typed out the words. "Hey Marcus, thanks again for coming to dinner last night. It was nice seeing you." I hit send before I could second-guess myself. The response came quicker than I expected. "The pleasure was mine. You and Lillian have a lovely home." I stared at the message, my heart beating faster than it should have. There was nothing unusual about it. Polite, complimentary, exactly what you'd expect. But I couldn't ignore the strange excitement bubbling beneath my skin. I typed another message, hesitating for a moment before pressing send. "It was good catching up. Lillian seemed happy to have you over." The reply came almost immediately. "I hope so. I've missed her. And you too, Ethan. You're good for her." There was something about the way he'd phrased it, personal, almost intimate. I reread the message, trying to decipher if I was imagining things. "You too, Ethan." The words clung to me, refusing to let go. Before I could think too much, another message appeared. "Maybe we could grab a coffee sometime, catch up properly." I stared at the screen, the words blinking up at me like a challenge. My first instinct was to say no, to brush it off as unnecessary. But there was a pull I couldn't deny, a curiosity I couldn't silence. It wasn't just Marcus himself, it was the way he made me feel, like I wasn't invisible, like someone noticed me. "Sure," I typed, my fingers trembling slightly. "When works for you?" The cafe was quiet when I arrived the next day, the kind of place that smelled like freshly ground coffee beans and worn books. I was early, too early, but I couldn't sit still at home. I found a table near the window and ordered a black coffee, my nerves making everything feel sharper and louder than it should have. The clink of cups behind the counter, the soft hum of conversation around me, the steady rain tapping against the glass. When Marcus walked in, it was like the room shifted. He spotted me immediately, his smile warm and effortless as he made his way over. "Ethan," he said, clasping my hand briefly before sitting across from me. "Good to see you." "You too," I said, trying to sound calm. He ordered a cappuccino, the barista laughing softly at some joke he made before returning to the counter. He had that effect on people. Our conversation started out simple, polite, the kind of back and forth you could overhear at any cafe. He asked about my job, my hobbies, and I answered, grateful for the distraction. But then his questions grew deeper. "Are you happy, Ethan?" he asked, his voice low and careful, like he wasn't sure how I'd respond. I hesitated, caught off guard by the directness of the question. "What do you mean?" "In your marriage," he clarified. "With Lillian. Are you happy?" The air between us felt heavy, charged. I looked down at my coffee, watching the steam curl and dissipate. "It's complicated," I said finally. He nodded, as though he'd expected that answer. "It usually is." There was no judgment in his tone, just quiet understanding. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on me in that steady way of his, and I felt something shift. It wasn't just that he understood, it was that he cared. The cafe felt smaller when I left, like the walls had closed in just a little. The rain was heavier now, soaking through my jacket as I walked to my car, but I barely noticed. I kept thinking about Marcus's question. The way his gaze had lingered on mine, waiting for an answer I hadn't been able to give. Are you happy, Ethan? The question stayed with me, pressing against the edges of my mind like a truth I wasn't ready to confront. I wasn't sure what I'd expected from my coffee with Marcus. Maybe I thought it would be like our dinner conversation. Light, polite, tinged with just enough personal connection to make it feel meaningful without crossing any lines. I'd even rehearsed a few safe topics in my head during the drive over. But when I stepped into the cafe that day, I realized I'd underestimated him. The place was almost empty, just a few scattered patrons hunched over laptops and cups of coffee. Marcus sat at a table near the window, his hands wrapped around a mug of tea. He'd arrived before me this time, and there was an ease to him, a quiet confidence in the way he seemed to fit seamlessly into the space. He saw me before I could say anything, his face breaking into that warm, familiar smile that somehow always felt tailored just for you. Ethan, he said, rising slightly from his chair as I approached. Glad you could make it. Yeah, thanks for inviting me, I replied, pulling out the chair across from him. A waitress appeared almost immediately, and I ordered a black coffee, barely registering her smile or the menu she placed on the table. Marcus, as always, seemed entirely present, offering her a polite nod before turning his attention back to me. How's your day been? He asked, leaning forward slightly, his elbows resting on the table. It's been fine, I said. Quiet. Quiet can be good, he replied, his voice low and thoughtful. Gives you time to think. I nodded, unsure how to respond. The coffee arrived and I busied myself with it, grateful for something to occupy my hands. But Marcus was patient, waiting until I met his gaze again before speaking. I've been thinking about last night, he said, his tone casual but deliberate. About you, Lillian, your life together. You've built something good, Ethan. I didn't respond right away. There was no malice in his words, no judgment. But there was a weight to them, a subtle invitation to look beneath the surface. Thanks, I said finally, though the word felt hollow. We've worked hard for it. Marcus tilted his head, studying me. But is it enough? The question hung in the air between us, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I'd heard him right. His voice had been soft, almost gentle, but the words hit me like a sharp gust of wind. I don't know what you mean, I said, even though I did. His smile was faint, almost apologetic. I think you do. I looked down at my coffee, my stomach tightening. Lillian and we've been through a lot together. Marriage isn't perfect, but we make it work. Of course, he said. That's what you're supposed to say, isn't it? We make it work. There was no malice in his tone, just quiet understanding, and that made it harder to dismiss him. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that he didn't know the first thing about my marriage. But the truth was he wasn't wrong, and he probably knew it. Do you ever feel like there's more? He asked, his voice dropping even lower. More to life than what you've built with Lillian? I hesitated, my throat tightening. Why are you asking me this? Because I've been where you are, he said, leaning back in his chair. His expression softened, and for a moment, I saw something in his eyes I hadn't expected. Vulnerability. I know what it's like to be in a marriage that looks perfect on the outside but leaves you feeling empty. His words hit me harder than I wanted to admit. Marcus continued, his tone measured. When I was married to Lillian's mother, I spent years pretending everything was fine. I loved her, don't get me wrong. But there was always a part of me that felt like I was just going through the motions. Like I'd built this life because it was what I was supposed to do, not because it was what I wanted. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. It's easy to ignore it at first, he said. You tell yourself it's just a rough patch, that things will get better. But then one day, you wake up, and you realize you've been lying to yourself for years. And by then, it's too late to fix it. His words sliced through me, leaving me feeling exposed in a way I hadn't anticipated. He wasn't just talking about himself. He was talking about me, about my marriage, about all the things I hadn't been brave enough to admit, even to myself. I don't know if I feel that way, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Marcus smiled faintly, his eyes holding mine. Maybe not yet. The silence between us stretched, heavy and charged. I should have been uncomfortable, but I wasn't. Marcus had this way of drawing you in, making you feel like you could tell him anything. And in that moment I wanted to. I wanted to tell him everything, about the loneliness, the resentment, the way I felt like a stranger in my own marriage. But I didn't. Instead, I took a long sip of coffee, the bitterness grounding me. This feels like a therapy session, I said, forcing a weak smile. He laughed softly, the sound low and warm. Sorry. Old habits. I raised an eyebrow. You were a therapist? Not officially, he said, his smile widening. But I've always been good at listening. People tell me things. Sometimes things they don't even realize they need to say. I nodded, my chest tightening. He wasn't wrong. When we parted ways, the rain had started again, light and steady, dampening the streets. Marcus clasped my shoulder briefly before we said goodbye, his touch lingering just long enough to send a shiver down my spine. "Take care of yourself, Ethan," he said, his voice low and sincere. "You too," I replied, though the words felt clumsy in my mouth. As I walked to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus had seen something in me I wasn't ready to face. And the worst part was, I wasn't sure I wanted to run from it anymore. When Marcus texted me the next day, I wasn't surprised. I'd been checking my phone all morning, even though I told myself I wasn't waiting for anything. "Are you free later? I've been meaning to show you my place." The message read. I stared at the screen, my pulse quickening. There was nothing unusual about it. No hidden subtext. Just a friendly invitation. But something about it felt significant, like I was standing at the edge of a line I hadn't quite crossed yet. I hesitated for a moment before typing my reply. "Sure. What time?" The drive to Marcus's house felt longer than it should have, even though it wasn't far. His place was on the outskirts of town, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood lined with old oak trees. As I pulled into his driveway, I noticed how different his house was from ours. It wasn't large or flashy, but there was a sense of character to it. Brick walls softened by ivy, a porch swing that creaked faintly in the breeze, potted plants arranged with deliberate care. It looked lived in, comfortable in a way that felt foreign to me. Marcus opened the door before I could knock, smiling as he stepped aside to let me in. "Ethan," he said, his voice warm. "Welcome." I stepped inside, and the first thing that struck me was how much the house felt like him. The scent of leather and cedar hung in the air, mingling with the faint aroma of freshly brewed tea. The walls were lined with bookshelves, their contents a mix of old classics and modern titles, spines worn from use. A few framed photographs were scattered here and there, most of them of Lillian as a child. "It's a bit of a bachelor pad," Marcus said with a chuckle, closing the door behind me. "But I like to think it has its charm." "It suits you," I said, and I meant it. He gestured toward the living room, where a fire crackled softly in the hearth. "Make yourself at home." "Tea?" "Sure," I replied, sitting on the leather couch while he disappeared into the kitchen. I looked around, taking in the space. There was something intimate about being here, like I was seeing a part of Marcus he didn't share with just anyone. It made me feel strange, almost intrusive, but also important. When he returned, he handed me a mug and sat down in the armchair across from me. The silence between us was easy, almost comforting, and for a moment, I let myself relax. "So," he said, breaking the quiet, "how are you feeling after our conversation the other day?" I froze, the mug halfway to my lips. Fine," I said, a little too quickly. "Why?" He smiled faintly. "Just curious. I know I have a habit of asking difficult questions." "That's an understatement," I muttered, and he laughed. "I don't mean to pry," he said, his tone softening. "I just think it's important to talk about these things. Most people go through life pretending everything's fine, even when it's not. It's easier that way." "Maybe," I said, setting the mug down on the coffee table. "But sometimes it's better not to dig too deep. You might not like what you find." Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "And what if what you find is the truth?" His words hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. I looked away, my gaze drifting to the fire. The flames danced and flickered, their movement hypnotic. "Truth isn't always a good thing," I said finally. Marcus studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he leaned back in his chair, his smile faint but genuine. "You're an interesting man, Ethan. You know that." I laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. "I don't think anyone's ever called me interesting before." "Then they haven't been paying attention." His words were simple, but they hit me harder than they should have. I met his gaze, and for a moment, I felt like he could see straight through me, past all the walls I'd built and the lies I'd told myself. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. "Let me show you something," Marcus said after a moment, standing and gesturing for me to follow him. He led me down a short hallway to a room that was part study, part library. The walls were lined with even more bookshelves, and a desk sat in the corner, cluttered with papers and pens. On one shelf, I noticed a small collection of vinyl records, their spines worn and faded. "This is where I spend most of my time," Marcus said, leaning against the desk. "It's my little sanctuary." "It's incredible," I said, running my fingers along the edge of one shelf. "I find that it helps to have a space that's yours, you know? Somewhere you can be yourself, away from everything else." His voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of vulnerability to it, like he was sharing something deeply personal. I nodded, my throat tightening. I don't think I've ever had that. Marcus looked at me, his expression softening. Maybe it's time you did. The tension between us was palpable now, thick enough to drown in. Marcus stepped closer, and I felt my pulse quicken, my breath catching in my throat. Ethan, he said, his voice low and steady. You don't have to keep carrying all of this on your own. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. All I could do was stand there, frozen, as he reached out and rested a hand on my shoulder. The touch was gentle but firm, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I looked up at him, my chest tightening as his gaze met mine. There was no hesitation in his eyes, no doubt, only quiet certainty. Before I knew what I was doing, I stepped closer. My heart was pounding, my mind racing, but I didn't stop. And then it happened. The kiss was soft at first, tentative like we were testing the waters, but it deepened quickly, the intensity building as months, years, of unspoken longing surged to the surface. I pulled away suddenly, my breath ragged, my chest heaving. I can't, I stammered, stepping back. Marcus didn't move. His expression was calm, understanding, but his eyes held something else, something raw and unshakable. It's okay, he said softly. Take your time. I turned and left the room, my mind spinning. I sat in my car outside Marcus's house for what felt like hours, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The street was quiet, the houses lined with darkened windows and glowing porch lights, but I couldn't hear or see any of it. All I could hear was my own breathing, loud and uneven, and the words Marcus had spoken just before I left. It's okay. Take your time. He'd said it so calmly, like there was no urgency, no pressure, like he understood exactly what I was feeling. And maybe he did. That was the part that scared me the most. When I finally started the engine and drove away, the silence in the car felt oppressive. The kiss played on an endless loop in my mind, every detail sharpened and vivid. The warmth of his hand on my shoulder, the softness of his lips, the way he'd tasted faintly of tea and something I couldn't place. It wasn't just the kiss that haunted me. It was what it meant, what it said about me, about my marriage, about the kind of man I was. By the time I got home, the house was dark except for the soft glow of a lamp in the living room. Lillian was still awake, curled up on the couch with a blanket draped over her lap and her laptop balanced on her knees. She looked up when I walked in, her face lighting up briefly before settling into something more neutral. Hey, she said, closing the laptop and setting it aside. You're home late. I shrugged, trying to keep my voice steady. Got caught up in something. She nodded, yawning as she stretched her arms over her head. I was going to head to bed soon. There's leftovers in the fridge if you're hungry. Thanks, I said, though I wasn't hungry. My stomach churned with guilt and something else I couldn't quite name. Lillian stood and kissed me lightly on the cheek before heading toward the bedroom. Don't stay up too late, she said over her shoulder, and just like that, she was gone. I watched her disappear down the hallway, a strange hollowness settling in my chest. It wasn't that I didn't love her. It was that I didn't know if love was enough anymore. I sat in the living room for hours after she went to bed, staring at the blank television screen as the events of the night replayed in my mind. I told myself it had been a mistake, a moment of weakness, but the words felt empty. The truth was, I didn't regret it. That realization hit me like a punch to the gut, and I sank deeper into the couch, my head in my hands. I didn't regret kissing Marcus. I didn't regret the way it had felt, the way he'd looked at me like I was someone worth seeing. But I regretted what it said about me. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Marcus. His steady gaze, his calm smile, the way he'd said, take your time, like he knew exactly how I would feel afterward. By the time morning came, I felt like a ghost of myself, pale and hollow-eyed as I sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Lillian was already up, bustling around the kitchen as she packed her bag for work. Are you feeling okay? She asked, pausing to look at me. You look tired. I didn't sleep well, I said, keeping my voice casual. She frowned slightly, her brow furrowing. Maybe you should take a day off. You've been working a lot lately. I nodded absently, though I knew I wouldn't take her advice. Work was the only thing that kept me from spiraling into the chaos of my own thoughts. Let me know if you need anything, she said, leaning down to kiss my forehead before grabbing her bag and heading for the door. Have a good day, I called after her, but the words felt hollow. The moment the door clicked shut behind her, the silence of the house closed in around me. I stared at the empty coffee cup in my hands, my mind racing. The sound of my phone vibrating on the table snapped me out of my daze. I glanced at the screen and felt my stomach lurch when I saw Marcus's name. I hope you're doing okay. I've been thinking about you. The message was simple, but it carried a weight that made my chest tighten. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, my thumb hovering over the screen as I debated whether or not to reply. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to pretend that none of this had happened. But another part of me, a stronger part, wanted to see him again. I started typing before I could second-guess myself. I'm fine. Last night was a lot. The response came almost instantly. It was, but it wasn't wrong. My breath caught in my throat as I reread his words, the simplicity of them cutting through all the noise in my head. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but deep down, I knew he wasn't. I don't know what to do, I replied finally, my fingers trembling. His reply was slower this time, but just as certain. You don't have to know right now. Just don't shut yourself off. Let yourself feel it, Ethan. I set the phone down, my hands shaking. His words stirred something in me, something I couldn't quite name. Guilt, longing, fear. But underneath it all was a quiet truth I couldn't ignore. For the first time in years, I felt alive, and that terrified me more than anything else. The park was nearly empty, just a scattering of joggers and a couple walking their dog on the far side of the pond. I sat on a wooden bench beneath the skeletal branches of a tree, the cold January wind biting through my jacket. Dead leaves skittered across the path in front of me, carried by the occasional gust of wind. The world felt still, muted, like it was holding its breath along with me. I hadn't planned to come here, but the walls of the house had felt too close, and I'd needed somewhere to think, somewhere quiet, somewhere I could sit and finally face the weight of everything that had been building inside me. I stared at the water, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. My thoughts circled endlessly, like a snake devouring its own tail. What was I doing? What had I done? Every time I thought I had an answer, it slipped through my fingers like smoke, leaving only more questions behind. Marcus's text still sat on my phone, unanswered. You don't have to know right now. Just don't shut yourself off. Let yourself feel it, Ethan. Let yourself feel it. I wanted to hate him for saying that, for making this all sound so simple. But it wasn't simple. It was messy and complicated and wrong in ways I couldn't even begin to articulate. And yet, I couldn't deny that he was right. For the first time in years, I felt not just the dull monotony of routine or the occasional flicker of affection for Lillian, but something real and alive and terrifying. It wasn't just about Marcus, it was about me, about everything I'd buried so deeply that I'd almost forgotten it was there. He'd pulled something out of me, something raw and unsteady, and I didn't know how to put it back. The sound of footsteps on the gravel path pulled me out of my thoughts. I glanced up, half expecting to see Marcus, even though I hadn't told him where I was. But it wasn't him. It was a woman jogging past, her headphones in, oblivious to the storm raging inside me. I exhaled shakily, leaning back against the bench. What would Lillian think if she knew? That thought hit me like a slap, my stomach twisting painfully. I could almost see her face, the hurt and confusion that would replace her smile, the inevitable questions. Why? How could you do this to me? Wasn't I enough? And the worst part was, I didn't know how to answer her. It wasn't that she wasn't enough. It was that I wasn't. I hadn't been enough for her, for our marriage, for the life we'd built together. I'd gone through the motions, done everything I was supposed to do, but somewhere along the way, I'd lost myself. And now I didn't know who I was anymore. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and stared at the screen, at Marcus's name sitting at the top of my messages. My thumb hovered over the keyboard, hesitating. What could I even say? I thought about the way he'd looked at me after the kiss, the quiet understanding in his eyes. He hadn't pushed, hadn't demanded anything. He'd just been there. I started typing, the words coming slowly at first, then faster as I let them spill out. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to feel. I'm terrified of what this means. For me. For everything. I stared at the message for a long time before hitting send. The moment it left my screen, a wave of anxiety crashed over me. My heart pounded as I waited for his response, every second stretching into an eternity. Finally, my phone vibrated. It's okay to be scared, Ethan. Fear just means you're on the edge of something real, but you don't have to face it alone. I closed my eyes, the weight of his words sinking into me. He always knew exactly what to say, exactly how to pull me back from the brink. But even as I read and reread his message, I couldn't shake the fear clawing at my chest. This wasn't just about Marcus. It was about everything I'd avoided for years. When I got home, the house was quiet. Lillian wasn't back yet, and I was grateful for the empty space. I dropped my keys on the counter and sank onto the couch, staring blankly at the wall. The events of the past few days played through my mind like a film I couldn't stop watching. The kiss, the texts, the way Marcus had looked at me like he could see every part of me, even the parts I tried to hide. And then there was Lillian, kind, loving Lillian who had no idea what I'd done. I thought about her laugh, the way she hummed to herself when she cooked, the way she always kissed me goodnight even when we argued. I thought about the life we'd built together, the memories we'd shared, the plans we'd made. And for the first time, I wondered if I could ever go back to that life. When Lillian came home that evening, she was carrying a bag of groceries, her face lit with the kind of cheerful energy I envied. "I stopped by the store on the way home," she said, setting the bag on the counter. "I was thinking we could do another dinner with Dad next week. What do you think?" My stomach lurched, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. Yeah," I said finally, forcing a smile. "That sounds good." She beamed at me, completely unaware of the storm raging inside me. Later that night, as I stood in front of the bathroom mirror brushing my teeth, I barely recognized the man staring back at me. He looked tired, worn, like someone caught between two lives. And the truth was, I didn't know what was going to happen next. I didn't know if I could fix my marriage, or if I even wanted to. I didn't know if Marcus and I had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. All I knew was that the man in the mirror wasn't the same man I'd been a week ago, and I didn't know if that was a good thing or a bad thing.